If this story keeps you listening, subscribe and tell me what horror story I should tell next. Your idea might be featured in a future episode. Let's begin. In the spring of 73 AD, a Roman soldier walked out of the Black Forest. He was the only survivor of a 500-man expeditionary force that had entered the forest 11 days earlier. He was uninjured. He was carrying no weapon. He was carrying no pack. He was walking in a straight line with the steady, measured gait of a man on a road. Except there was no road. The ground beneath him was root and mud and centuries of fallen leaves, and he walked across it as if it were paved stone, his sandals caked to the ankle, his tunic torn at the shoulder, but his body whole. He walked directly to the nearest frontier outpost, a timber and earth fortification on the Rhine called Mogontiacum. The place we now call Mainz identified himself by rank and legion to the duty officer and delivered a verbal report. The duty officer wrote the report down. He noted later that the soldier spoke clearly and without emotion, like a man reading from a prepared text, and that his eyes did not blink during the entire recitation. Then a courier arrived from the regional command post at Colonia Agrippina. He carried orders that had been prepared before the soldier emerged from the forest. The orders said 3 things. Classify the verbal report under the Schwarzwald administrative notation and restrict access to command staff. Transfer the soldier to the garrison at Syene, in Upper Egypt, effective immediately. And filed a standing requisition for the next Schwarzwald sector expedition, to be dispatched no sooner than 14 months from the current date. The duty officer was disturbed, not by the soldier's account, though the account was disturbing. He was disturbed because the transfer orders were dated 3 days before the soldier walked out of the forest. Someone at regional command had known he was coming. Someone had known there would be exactly 1 survivor. Because there was always exactly 1. This is the story of what those expeditions found, why Rome kept sending them, and what has been standing in the Black Forest, patiently, carefully, and with increasing frustration for longer than any empire has existed. The sources for this account are fragmented. A handful of requisition forms preserved in the Rhine Frontier archives, a single testimony recorded by an Egyptian temple priest in the 2nd century, a set of field observations compiled by a Germanic tribal historian in the early medieval period, and 1 modern archaeological survey that found something in the Schwarzwald that does not match any known Roman engagement. None of these sources should corroborate each other. They come from different centuries, different languages, different civilizations. But they describe the same place, the same events, and the same thing waiting inside the trees. I'm going to tell you what they describe, and I want you to pay attention to 1 detail above all others. The creature in this story never wanted to hurt anyone. It tried, for over a century, to deliver a single message. Rome's failure was not that it couldn't hear. Rome's failure was that it had no mechanism for listening. To understand what happened in the Black Forest, you first have to understand what the Rhine Frontier was in the 1st century AD. It was not a wall. It was not a line on a map. It was a living military organism, a chain of fortified camps, watchtowers, patrol routes, and supply depots stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, staffed by tens of thousands of professional soldiers whose entire purpose was to keep the empire's border stable and the Germanic tribes on the other side of it. The Rhine was Rome's most important boundary in northern Europe, and the legions stationed along it were among the best trained, best equipped fighting forces in the ancient world. They were also, by the middle of the 1st century, deeply familiar with the terrain. Roman patrols routinely crossed the Rhine into Germanic territory on scouting missions, punitive raids, and diplomatic expeditions. The forests east of the river were not unknown. They were mapped, classified, and integrated into Roman operational planning with the bureaucratic precision that defined everything the empire did. Every significant waterway, every major tribal settlement, every reliable ford and mountain pass within 100 miles of the Rhine had a Roman designation and a Roman file. Except for one area. The Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, occupied a stretch of territory southeast of the Rhine's middle course, in the region the Romans called Agri Decumates. It was known to be dense, mountainous, and sparsely populated even by Germanic standards. The tribes who lived in its outer reaches were loosely organized and generally not considered a serious military threat. Roman patrols entered the forest's edges regularly. They reported nothing unusual. Standard timber, standard terrain, standard difficulty. But the deep interior, the central mass of the forest, the area more than 2 or 3 days' march from the nearest river access, was different. Not on paper. On paper, it was simply dense forest, difficult to traverse, strategically insignificant. The official Roman assessment was that the Schwarzwald's interior was not worth the logistical cost of occupation. There were no resources there that couldn't be obtained more efficiently elsewhere. There were no tribal populations significant enough to require subjugation. The forest was, in the language of Roman military planning, a non-priority sector. That was the official position. The administrative record tells a different story. Beginning in approximately 12 BC, less than a decade after Rome established its Rhine Frontier, the military command at Mogontiacum began issuing requisition forms for expeditionary forces to be dispatched into the Schwarzwald central sector. The requisitions followed a standard format: 500 infantry, officer cadre, 14 days provisions, and 1 Germanic interpreter with specific knowledge of the deep forest. The first requisition is unremarkable. Scouting expeditions were common. What is remarkable is the second one. It was filed 17 months later. Same unit size, same provisions, same sector designation, same request for a Germanic interpreter, no reference to the previous expedition, no after-action report linking the two, no indication that the first expedition had ever returned, or that the second one was aware of the first, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. Over the next 120 years, the Mogontiacum archives contain 49 identical requisitions for the Schwarzwald central sector. They span the reigns of 8 emperors. They are written by dozens of different administrative hands, and not one of them, not a single one, has a corresponding return report, casualty assessment, or post-mission filing of any kind. 49 expeditions walked into the Black Forest. On paper, none of them walked out. But something else appears in the archives, if you know where to look. Transfer orders, individual transfers, filed under administrative codes that don't correspond to any standard Roman classification system. One soldier at a time moved from Rhine Frontier postings to distant provincial garrisons, Egypt, Judea, Britannia, North Africa, within days of a Schwarzwald requisition's expected completion date. The transfers are not flagged. They carry no explanation. They are buried in routine personnel movements, invisible unless you are specifically looking for the pattern. Someone was coming back from those expeditions. One person, every time. And Rome was making that person disappear, not through violence, but through geography. Send them far enough away, and their story dies with them. Almost. In the year 73 AD, the year of the 23rd requisition, one of those survivors reached Egypt, and he told a priest everything. The soldier's name does not survive. The Egyptian temple record identifies him only by rank optio, a senior non-commissioned officer equivalent to a modern company sergeant, and by the notation that he served with the Legio IV Macedonica, which was stationed at Mogontiacum during the relevant period. He told his story to a priest of Thoth at a temple in Siene, the garrison town at the empire's southern edge where he had been transferred. The priest recorded the account on papyrus in Demotic Egyptian, which is likely why it survived. Rome's censors were not reading Egyptian temple records. The account begins with the commission. The Optio describes a routine briefing at Mogontiacum in early spring. 500 men drawn from the legion's available strength, organized into a temporary expeditionary cohort under the command of a legate named Gnaeus Sertorius, Pollio. The Optio had served under Pollio before and considered him competent but politically ambitious, the type of officer who took frontier commands because they offered opportunities for distinction that garrison duty did nowhere. The mission, as briefed, was straightforward. 3 frontier outposts in the Schwarzwald sector had gone silent. They had not responded to signal fires or courier dispatch in over 3 weeks. The assumption was Germanic tribal activity, a raid, an ambush, perhaps a hostage situation requiring negotiated withdrawal. The expeditionary force was to march into the sector, assess the outposts, recover any survivors, and neutralize any tribal threat. The Optio notes that none of the soldiers found this alarming. Outposts went silent periodically. The frontier was vast, communication was slow, and Germanic raiders were a routine hazard. The men packed their kits, drew their rations, and assembled at the river crossing with the professional indifference of soldiers who had done this type of work many times before. There was one unusual addition to the force, a Germanic guide, a man the Optio describes as old, gray-bearded, captured in the Chatti campaigns and held since under Roman custody. The guide had been specifically requisitioned from a detention facility, and his file carried a notation the Optio had never seen before: expendable classification. This meant, in Roman administrative language, that the man's death during the expedition would not require a report or an inquiry. He was, on paper, already written off. The guide's name is not recorded either. The Optio refers to him only as the German. He describes him as quiet, cooperative, and visibly familiar with the forest, as a man who had lived in or near the Schwarzwald before his capture. The guide did not resist the assignment. He did not protest or attempt to flee. But the Optio noticed something on the morning of departure that stayed with him. When the column turned east toward the forest, the guide closed his eyes for a long moment, and his lips moved without sound. The Optio, who had seen many men pray before battle, recognized the gesture. But this was not prayer. It was resignation. The man was not asking for help. He was saying goodbye. The march to the forest's edge took 2 days. The terrain was unremarkable, rolling farmland, giving way to scattered woodland, the last Germanic settlements thinning as the ground rose toward the Schwarzwald's western slopes. The soldiers marched in standard formation, maintaining the discipline and pace that Roman training drilled into every legionary until it became as automatic as breathing. They sang marching songs. They complained about the food. They were, in every observable way, an ordinary Roman military column on an ordinary frontier mission. They reached the first outpost on the evening of the second day. It was intact. The palisade was standing. The gate was closed, but not barricaded. Inside, the fire pits held cold ash, perhaps a week old, perhaps 2. The equipment stores were full. Bedrolls were laid out in the barracks. Personal items sat on shelves and hung from pegs. Ration containers were sealed and undisturbed. Water barrels were full. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no damaged equipment, no bodies, no indication that violence of any kind had occurred. The outpost had not been attacked. It had simply been emptied, as if every man inside had stood up, set down whatever he was holding, and walked away in the same direction at the same time. The legate ordered a search of the surrounding area. Nothing. No tracks leading from the outpost, or rather, no tracks that could be reliably followed, because the forest floor was a mat of needles and moss that held impressions poorly. The scouts reported the same finding at the second outpost, 2 miles deeper, and the third, another mile beyond that. All intact, all empty, all abandoned without any evidence of why. The Optio records that it was at the third outpost that the guide spoke for the first time since departure. They were standing inside the barracks, surrounded by the possessions of men who had simply ceased to be present, and the guide pointed to the western wall, the wall facing the forest's interior, and said, in his accented but functional Latin, "They followed it. They always follow it." The legate asked what they followed. The guide said, "The thing that calls." The legate asked what that meant. The guide shook his head and did not answer again. That night, while the expeditionary force camped at the third outpost, the Optio walked the perimeter and saw the first of the warnings. Nailed to a tree at the outpost's northeastern corner, approximately 8 feet above the ground, was a Roman infantry sword, a gladius, driven through the bark with enough force to embed the blade 3 inches into the wood. It was heavily corroded. The leather grip had rotted away decades ago. But the placement was deliberate, and the Optio noticed something that made him stop and look more carefully. There was a second gladius nailed to a tree 30 feet beyond the first, and a third beyond that, and a fourth, a line of Roman swords, each one driven into a tree at the same height, extending into the forest in a straight line that pointed deeper into the interior. The line continued beyond the range of his torch. He reported this to the legate. The legate examined the swords and noted their age at least 30 years old, possibly more. He concluded they were markers left by a previous expedition to indicate a route. A reasonable interpretation. The Optio accepted it. But he noticed that the guide, who had been watching the legate's inspection from a distance, was weeping. Silently, without movement. The way a man weeps when he has known something terrible for a very long time and has just watched someone else fail to understand it. On the third day of the march, the forest changed. The Optio's account is precise about this. He was a career soldier, trained to observe terrain the way a sailor observes weather, not for beauty, but for information. And the information the forest gave him on the third day was wrong. The trees were larger. That was expected. They were moving deeper into old growth, away from the edges where Germanic peoples cleared timber. But the size was not the issue. The issue was the uniformity. Every tree was approximately the same height. Every trunk was approximately the same diameter. The spacing between them was regular. Not geometrically perfect, but close enough that the eye registered it as pattern rather than chance. The forest floor, which had been cluttered with deadfall and undergrowth at the edges, was clean. Not cleared. Clean. As if the ground itself rejected anything that fell on it. The sounds changed too. At the forest's edge, there had been birds, insects, the movement of small animals in the underbrush. By midday on the third day, these sounds had stopped. Not gradually, the Optio marks the moment. They were marching through a narrow valley between 2 ridges, and one step the forest was alive, and the next step it was not. The silence was so abrupt that several soldiers stumbled, as if the ground had shifted. The human ear is calibrated to ambient sound. Remove it entirely, and the body interprets the absence as a physical disturbance. Men reached for their weapons without knowing why. The guide stopped walking. The Optio, who was near the rear of the column, moved forward to see what was happening. The guide was standing in the center of the path, his arms at his sides, his head slightly raised. He was not looking at anything specific. He was listening. And after a long moment, he said, not to the legate, not to the Optio, but to the forest itself, "We hear you. We are coming through. We mean you no harm." He said it in his own language. Then he said it again in Latin. Then he started walking again. The legate demanded an explanation. The guide said nothing. They found the first old camp an hour later. It was Roman. There was no mistaking it. The layout followed standard marching camp protocol. Ditches had been dug in the regulation V-shape. Post holes marked where a palisade had stood. Fire pits were arranged in the regulation grid. But the wood had rotted to nothing decades ago. The ditch walls had softened and partly filled with soil. Moss covered everything. This camp had been built 40, perhaps 50 years earlier, and no one had visited it since. Inside the camp's perimeter, the expeditionary force found equipment. Roman equipment. Corroded, soil-stained, but recognizable belt fittings, hobnails from military sandals, a bronze mess kit, the iron boss of a shield. These items were not scattered. They were arranged, laid out in rows, sorted by type, organized with a care that was immediately and deeply wrong, because the organization did not match Roman practice. A Roman quartermaster would have sorted equipment by unit or by function. These items were sorted by material: iron in one row, bronze in another, leather remnants in a third. Bone, and there was bone, human bone, cleaned and weathered in a fourth. Something had gone through this camp after the soldiers died, and organized their remains by composition. The Optio studied the arrangement for a long time. He notes in his account that the other soldiers refused to enter the camp's perimeter. They stood outside the ditch line and stared, and some of them made the sign against evil, and the youngest soldiers' boys, really, 17 and 18 years old, on their first frontier assignment, pressed close to the older men without speaking. It was the guide who found the carved message. On a post at what would have been the camp's Principia, the command tent's location, someone had used a knife or chisel to cut Latin words into the wood. The carving was deep, deliberate, and still legible despite decades of weathering. It read, Legio 14th Gemina, Cohor 2nd, Tertius Dies, Res non hostilis, Res non animalis, Monamur, non audimur, qui legit, revertere. 14th Legion, Gemina, 2nd Cohort, 3rd Day. The thing is not hostile. The thing is not an animal. We are warned. We are not heard. Whoever reads this, turn back. The Optio stared at that message for a long time. He recognized the legion the 14th Gemina had been stationed on the Rhine decades earlier, before being transferred east. He had never seen any record of the 14th Gemina operating in the Schwarzwald. No campaign history mentioned it. No casualty list bore its name in connection with this sector. But here was their camp. Here were their dead. Here was their message carved by a Roman hand, in Roman Latin, with Roman military precision, begging whoever came next to do the one thing Roman soldiers were never trained to do: turn back. The legate read the message. He was quiet for a moment. Then he ordered the column to continue the advance. The guide looked at the Optio. The Optio looked back. Nothing was said. But the Optio records that in that moment he felt the first fracture in his understanding of what this expedition was. He had believed it was a rescue mission. Find the missing outpost garrisons, assess the threat, report back. Standing in a dead camp full of sorted bones, reading a 40-year-old plea for retreat, he began to suspect it was something else entirely. They found a second old camp before nightfall, then a third the next morning. Each one was older than the last. Each one had its dead organized in the same material sorted pattern. Each one had a carved message, different words, different legions, but the same essential content. We were warned. We did not listen. turn back. The messages spanned decades. The oldest camp they found barely visible, its ditches almost completely filled, its post holes marked only by depressions in the moss, bore a carving so weathered it was nearly illegible. The Optio spent an hour tracing the letters with his fingers. The legion named was one he did not recognize. The date, as far as he could determine, was approximately 80 years before his own expedition. 80 years of Roman soldiers walking into this forest. 80 years of carved warnings left for the next group. And not one of those warnings had ever reached Rome. Not one had ever appeared in the administrative record. Not one had ever stopped the next requisition from being filed. The Optio began to count the camps. He counted 7 before the legate ordered him to stop mapping their positions. On the 5th day, the Optio did something he had been trained never to do. He disobeyed a direct order. The legate had told him to stop mapping the old camps. The Optio mapped them anyway. Quietly, on a wax tablet he kept inside his tunic, using the abbreviated notation system that Roman surveyors used for field sketches. He marked each camp's position relative to the last, noted its approximate age based on the condition of the earthworks, and recorded the legion designation from each carved message. By the end of the 5th day, he had something that looked like a pattern. The camps were not random. They were distributed along a line, not a perfectly straight line, but a clear directional trend running west to east, from the forest's outer reaches toward its interior. And they stopped. Every camp, every set of remains, every carved warning, they all existed on the western side of an invisible boundary. The Optio could see no physical marker for this boundary, no ridge, no river, no change in terrain that would explain why Roman expeditions consistently penetrated to this depth and no further. But the evidence was unambiguous. For 80 years, Roman soldiers had walked into this forest, reached this line, and died. Not one artifact, not one bone, not one carved message existed beyond it. It was as if the forest had a threshold, and everything that crossed it was simply erased. He showed the map to the guide. The guide looked at it for a long time. Then he placed his finger on the invisible line and said, "You see it?" The Optio asked what it was. "The edge of its home," the guide said. "My people have known where it is since before your people knew our lands existed. We do not cross it. We do not hunt near it. We tell our children about it before we tell them about the gods, because the gods are a story, and this is not." The Optio asked what happened when someone crossed the line. The guide said, "You are about to find out. Your commander will not stop." He was right. The legate had been pushing the pace since dawn, moving the column faster than standard march discipline allowed. The soldiers were tired, uneasy, and increasingly reluctant. They had passed through 7 camps of dead Romans. They had read warnings carved by men exactly like themselves, men with the same training, the same equipment, the same orders who had come here and not returned. The evidence of what awaited them was literally beneath their feet, and they were being marched across it as if it were not there. That evening, the legate called a command meeting. The Optio attended, as was his right and duty as second in command of the expeditionary cohort. 3 other centurions were present. The guide was excluded. The legate laid out his assessment. The abandoned outposts suggested a significant threat, tribal or otherwise, that had moved into the sector. The old camps confirmed that previous Roman forces had encountered this threat and been defeated. The current expedition's orders were to assess the nature of the threat and determine whether it had expanded its area of control since the last assessment. The Optio stopped him. He asked the legate to repeat the last phrase. Since the last assessment, the legate repeated it without hesitation. He said it as if it were self-evident. The Optio asked when the last assessment had been conducted. The legate paused. Then he reached into his command satchel and produced a sealed leather pouch that the Optio had noticed him carrying since departure, but had never seen him open. The legate broke the seal and removed a folded document written on vellum, not a standard military dispatch, but a formal administrative order bearing the seal of the provincial governor's office. The order was addressed not to the legate by name, but to the commanding officer of the Schwarzwald Sector Expeditionary Force. It was written in the formulaic language of Roman bureaucratic procedure, and it said the following: "The bearer is authorized to advance into the Schwarzwald Central Sector to a depth not exceeding the boundary established by previous survey. The bearer is to confirm the current position of the boundary by identifying the forward limit of territorial response. The bearer is to note any expansion or contraction of the boundary relative to the previous survey, conducted 17 months prior. The bearer is to ensure that one member of the expeditionary force, selected for reliability and discretion, is positioned to withdraw in the event of general engagement. This individual is to deliver a verbal report of the boundary's current position to the garrison commander at Mogontiacum upon emergence from the sector. The bearer is reminded that the contents of this order are classified under the Schwarzwald administrative notation and are not to be shared with the expeditionary force." The Optio read the order twice. The other centurions read it. The tent was very quiet. The Optio records the moment in his testimony with a restraint that makes it more devastating than any outburst could. He writes, "I understood then that we were not a rescue mission. We were not a punitive expedition. We were not soldiers performing a soldier's duty. We were a measuring instrument. We had been sent into the forest to walk until something killed us, so that the distance we covered before dying could be compared to the distance the last group covered before dying. The boundary, the creature, the territory Rome knew. Rome had always known, and Rome had decided that the most efficient way to monitor the situation was to feed its soldiers every 17 months and see how deep they got." The legate, to his limited credit, did not lie. He told the Optio and the centurions that yes, the Schwarzwald expeditions were a long-standing monitoring program. He told them that the creature he used the word res, the Latin term for thing, the same word the carved warnings had used, had maintained a stable territorial boundary for decades. He told them that the purpose of each expedition was to confirm the boundary had not moved, and that the requisition of a Germanic guide was intended to provide a witness from outside Roman command structure who could corroborate the boundary's position through tribal geographic knowledge. He told them that someone always survived, that the creature, for reasons no one in Roman command understood, consistently allowed one member of each expedition to leave, that this survivor's report was the data point, that the transfer orders to distant provinces were standard procedure to prevent the survivor from contaminating frontier morale. He said all of this calmly, as a man explains a system he did not design and does not question. The Optio asked how many expeditions there had been before this one. The legate consulted the order. "This is the 23rd, he said. The Optio did the arithmetic. 23 expeditions, 500 men each, 11,500 Roman soldiers, fed into the same stretch of forest over the course of a century, with the full knowledge and authorization of the provincial government. 11,500 men, whose deaths were not recorded as casualties, not honored as sacrifices, and not acknowledged as anything at all, because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging the thing that killed them, and acknowledging the thing that killed them would mean admitting that there was something inside the empire's borders that the empire could not control. 11,500 men, converted into a dataset. The Optio excused himself from the meeting. He walked to the edge of the camp. He stood in the darkness at the perimeter of the torchlight, looking east into the forest, and for the first time in his 17 years of service, he did not know what he was. The guide found him there. The old man sat beside him without speaking. After a while, the Optio told him what the sealed orders contained. The guide listened. Then he said something that the Optio recorded as the single most important sentence of the entire expedition. Your empire has a word for everything. You name your roads. You name your gods. You name the months and the coins and the ranks of every man who serves. But you have no word for this. You have never given it a name, and that is how I know you are afraid of it. Because Romans name what they have conquered, and they refuse to name what they cannot. They crossed the boundary on the 6th day. The Optio knew the moment it happened. Not because the terrain changed, though it did, subtly. The trees beyond the line were older. Not larger, necessarily, but older in a way that was difficult to articulate. Their bark was darker. Their branches began higher on the trunk. The canopy above was so dense that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight, even at midday. The air was cooler by several degrees, and it carried a scent the Optio could not identify. Not decay, not vegetation, not animal musk, but something mineral, something that reminded him of the smell inside a cave. He knew the moment because of the guide. The old man had been walking at the column's flank, quiet and watchful, for 5 days. When they crossed the line, he stopped. He placed both hands flat on the nearest tree trunk, pressed his forehead to the bark, and spoke in his own language softly, at length, in a cadence that the Optio recognized as formal address. The guide was not praying. He was announcing them. The soldiers noticed the change, too, though most could not have said what specifically was different. The column's pace slowed without any order being given. Men who had been talking fell silent. Hands moved to weapons, not drawing them, not gripping them aggressively, but touching them the way a child touches a familiar object in a dark room. Reassurance. Proof that the world still contained things they understood. The legate pushed them forward. 2 hours past the boundary, they found the clearing. It was approximately 60 paces across, roughly circular, and it was the most disturbing place the Optio had ever stood. The ground was bare earth, not cleared, not burned, but bare in the way that bedrock is bare. Nothing grew there. The soil was dark, almost black, packed smooth and cool to the touch. Around the clearing's perimeter, trees stood in a ring so even it looked planted, and in the center, arranged with a precision that stopped every soldier in his tracks, was the equipment of the dead. Roman equipment. Hundreds of pieces. Organized not by the creature's earlier material sorting method, the Optio recognized the difference immediately, but by unit. Legionary insignia laid in groups, belt buckles arranged in formation patterns, hobnails sorted into clusters of 80 the size of a standard century, shield bosses stacked in rows of 6, the depth of a standard battle line, swords placed in parallel, hilts aligned, blades pointing east. The equipment came from every expedition that had crossed this boundary. Decades of Roman steel and bronze and leather and bone, catalogued with a fidelity that was, in its way, more precise than anything the Roman archive at Mogontiacum had achieved. The creature had not merely killed these men. It had studied what they carried. It had learned the organizational logic of the Roman military century, cohort, legion, and applied it to the remains. This was not a trophy display. This was a record. The Optio walked through the clearing slowly, reading the unit designations from corroded insignia. He found the 14th Gemina's equipment near the center, the same legion whose carved warning he had read days ago. He found units he recognized, and units he did not. He found equipment that predated his own service by generations. And he found, at the clearing's eastern edge, a space that was empty. A gap in the arrangement, precisely the size of a 500-man cohort's equipment, with bare earth smoothed flat and waiting. The space was for them. The creature had already prepared their place in its archive. The soldiers saw it too. The youngest centurion, a man the Optio describes as brave in the way that men are brave when they have not yet learned what bravery costs, began to shake. He did not run. He did not cry out. He stood in front of the empty space and shook as if the ground beneath him were trembling, though it was not. The legate ordered the force into defensive formation. Shields up. Pila ready. Standard perimeter. The soldiers obeyed muscle memory overriding the part of the mind that was screaming. And for a moment, the clearing looked like any Roman military position. Organized, controlled, professional. That was the moment the Optio saw the creature. Not all of it. He is very clear about this in his testimony. He did not see the creature the way you see an animal. Whole, bounded, comprehensible. He saw part of it, and the part he saw was enough. It was between the trees at the clearing's northern edge. It was dark, not black, not shadowed, but a color his mind could not resolve, as if the space it occupied simply failed to report to his eyes correctly. It was tall. The Optio was a practical man, not given to exaggeration, and his estimate was that what he could see, which he believed was not the creature's full extent, rose above the surrounding trees. Those trees were old growth, 80, 90 feet. It was not shaped like an animal. It was not shaped like a man. It was shaped like something that had been in that forest for so long that the forest had grown around it, and it had grown into the forest, and the boundary between organism and environment had dissolved centuries before Rome existed. It did not move. It did not make a sound. It simply occupied the space between the trees with an authority that was not aggressive, not threatening, but absolute, the way a mountain occupies a valley. It was there. It had always been there. And the Roman military formation arrayed in its clearing, with their shields and their swords and their century of imperial confidence, looked, the Optio uses this word, brief. They looked like something that would not last. The Optio stared at it. He could not tell if it was looking back. He could not identify eyes or a face or any feature that suggested a sensory organ oriented in his direction. But he felt observed, not watched, observed, the way a naturalist observes an insect, without malice, without fascination, with the detached, thorough attention of an intelligence cataloging something it has seen many times before. The guide was kneeling, not in worship, in acknowledgement, the way his people knelt when entering another chieftain's hall. He was recognizing the clearing for what it was, a seat of authority. The creature's claim made physical, its evidence displayed, its message, assembled across a century of Roman dead, laid out in a language it had painstakingly learned from the very soldiers it had killed. The message was, I am here. This is mine. I have shown you again and again and again. Stop coming. The legate held formation until nightfall. The creature did not move. It remained at the clearing's edge, vast and still and patient, while 500 Roman soldiers stood in the falling darkness, with their shields raised against something that had not attacked them and showed no indication of attacking. When full dark came, the legate ordered torches lit and watches set. No fires, there was nothing to burn in the clearing's bare earth, and no soldier was willing to enter the trees to gather wood. The men ate cold rations in formation. Nobody slept. The Optio spent the night hours doing something he understood might be the last useful act of his military career. He compiled his map. He cross-referenced every camp's position, every carved warning, every unit designation from the clearing's archive. He built, on his wax tablet, a document that no one in Rome had ever assembled, a complete chronological record of the Schwarzwald expeditions, reconstructed from the creature's own evidence. The record was devastating. The earliest equipment in the clearing dated to approximately 15 BC. The most recent, before the Optio's own expedition, was from approximately 18 months prior, the 22nd expedition, the one referenced in the legate's sealed orders as the previous survey. 105 years of Roman soldiers walking into this forest at regular intervals, reaching this clearing or somewhere near it, and dying. But the record showed something else, something worse. The unit designations in the clearing were organized chronologically. The creature had arranged them in the order they arrived. And the distance from the forest's edge to the clearing's location, compared to the positions of the old camps the Optio had mapped on the march in, told a story. The earliest camps were deep in the forest, farther from the edge than the clearing itself. The later camps were progressively closer to the edge. The boundary wasn't stable. It had been contracting. In the early decades, Roman expeditions had penetrated deep into the forest before encountering the creature's territory. Over time, the creature's boundary had moved outward, toward the frontier. Each expedition encountered the creature sooner than the one before. The territory was expanding. Slowly. Perhaps a mile per decade, but measurably. The Optio understood then why Rome kept sending expeditions. Not out of stupidity, not out of bureaucratic inertia, out of genuine strategic necessity. The creature's territory was growing. If it continued at the observed rate, it would reach the Rhine Frontier within a few centuries. The expeditions were not just measuring the boundary, they were monitoring a threat trajectory. But this understanding came with a second, more terrible realization. If Rome had been tracking the expansion for a century, then the sealed orders, the classification, the suppression, the transfer of survivors were not acts of shame. They were acts of strategy. Rome was hiding the creature not because it was embarrassed, but because it had no solution. You cannot fight something you cannot describe. You cannot rally legions against an enemy that has no name, no category, no precedent in the Roman understanding of the world. The Schwarzwald administrative notation was not a cover-up. It was a containment protocol, containing not the creature, but the knowledge of the creature, because that knowledge, if spread, would undermine the foundational myth of Roman invincibility more thoroughly than any military defeat ever could. The Optio set down his tablet and looked across the clearing at the creature. It was still there. It had not moved. And in the torchlight, the Optio saw something he had missed in the daylight. The trees nearest the creature were leaning toward it, not bent by wind or weight, but inclined gently, slightly, organically, as if they had spent decades growing in the direction of something they recognized as the center of their world. The forest was not the creature's habitat. The forest was the creature's expression. It grew where the creature was, the way moss grows on stone. The trees, the soil, the silence, they were not features of the environment. They were features of it. The boundary was not the edge of the creature's territory. It was the edge of the creature's body. The Optio writes, "I understood then that we had not entered a forest that contained a creature. We had entered a creature that resembled a forest, and it had been growing toward us for a century." At dawn on the seventh day, the creature spoke. Not in language, not in sound, in arrangement. The soldiers woke those who had slept. which was few to find that the clearing had changed overnight. The archived equipment, the century of catalogued Roman dead, had been moved. Not disturbed, not scattered, not thrown. Moved. Reorganized. Every piece of equipment in the clearing had been rearranged into a single configuration, while 500 soldiers stood or sat within 30 yards of it. Nobody had heard anything. Nobody had seen anything. The watches had been manned. The torches had been burning. And in the absolute silence of the night, the creature had reached into its own archive and reconstructed it. The new arrangement was not sorted by unit. It was not sorted by material. It was a pattern. The Optio recognized it immediately. He had spent 17 years in the Roman army. He had seen this pattern 1,000 times. It was a formation diagram. The equipment had been laid out in the exact configuration of a Roman marching column vanguard, main body, rear guard, flanking screens. The swords represented soldiers. The shield bosses represented officers. The belt fittings marked the position of standard bearers. The creature had built a map of a Roman military formation using Roman military equipment. And at the front of the formation, the position of the vanguard, the leading edge of the column, the swords were turned around. They pointed west, back toward the Rhine, back toward Rome. The Optio looked at the guide. The guide was nodding, slowly, with the expression of a man who has waited a very long time for someone else to see what he has always seen. "It's telling you to go home," the guide said. "It's been telling you to go home for 100 years." The creature had learned to communicate, not through sound, not through writing, though the Optio would later wonder whether it had attempted that too, in ways the Romans had misunderstood. It communicated through objects, through arrangement, through the physical grammar of the Roman military system, which it had spent a century observing, disassembling, and reconstructing until it could produce messages in a language its intruders would understand. The equipment on the trees at the forest's edge, the swords driven into bark in lines, the items sorted and displayed, those weren't trophies. They weren't warnings in the human sense. They were drafts, early, crude attempts at communication by an intelligence that was learning a language from the dead. The creature had been practicing, refining. Each expedition gave it more material to study, more examples of Roman organizational logic to decode. The warnings had become more sophisticated over time, from simple material sorting to unit-based cataloging to this, a complete tactical diagram rendered in the equipment of the dead. The creature was not angry that the Romans kept coming. It was frustrated. It had been trying to say the same thing for 100 years, and every time it said it, Rome sent another 500 men who couldn't read the message. The legate stared at the formation diagram for a long time. The Optio watched his face and saw something he had never seen in a commanding officer's expression: comprehension without authority. The legate understood what he was looking at. He understood what it meant. And he had absolutely no framework for what to do about it, because the Roman military system contained procedures for fighting, retreating, negotiating, and surrendering. But it contained no procedure for being spoken to by the forest. He ordered the men to prepare for a defensive march westward. Retreat. The first retreat the Optio had ever participated in. The soldiers moved quickly, driven by a motivation more powerful than discipline, the desperate animal desire to be somewhere else. They did not make it out of the clearing. The creature moved. The Optio describes this with the halting, inadequate precision of a man trying to convey something his senses were not designed to process. It did not charge. It did not lunge. It shifted. The trees at the clearing's edge, which were, the Optio now understood, part of it, leaned inward. The canopy closed. The twilight became darkness. The clearing, which had been open on all sides, became enclosed, not sealed, not walled, enclosed, the way a hand encloses an insect, gently, completely, with the unmistakable implication of power held in reserve. The creature was not attacking, it was insisting. The soldiers who broke formation died. The Optio is clear about this and does not describe it in detail. He says only, "The men who ran toward the trees were taken by the trees." I do not know how. I did not see bodies afterward. The trees moved, and the men were gone, and the sound they made was very brief. The soldiers who held formation survived. The creature did not touch the shield wall. It did not breach the perimeter. It took only the men who separated, who panicked, who ran, who broke the structure of the group and became individuals moving through the creature's space without the collective coherence that the creature had learned to read as a unit. The Optio understood then. The creature recognized Roman formations. It had studied them, cataloged them, replicated them in equipment diagrams. It understood that a formation was a single thing, a collective organism, a structure with meaning. And it would not attack a structure. It only took the pieces that fell off. 83 soldiers died in the first hour. All of them had broken from formation. The remaining 417 held terrified, weeping, some of them screaming, but they held. And the creature stopped. It pulled back. The trees straightened. The canopy opened. Daylight returned. And in the center of the clearing, where the formation diagram had been, there was a new arrangement. The equipment of the 83 dead soldiers, their swords, their shields, their belts, their sandals, every piece of material that had been on their bodies laid out in the familiar pattern, sorted, catalogued, added to the archive. The creature had absorbed them into its record in real time. It had processed them, organized them, and filed them before the surviving soldiers' tears had dried. Then the Optio noticed something that nearly broke him. His own equipment, his personal items, his belt, his writing tablet, his small bronze figurine of Fortuna that he had carried for 17 years was not in the archive. It was set apart, placed at the clearing's western edge, facing the direction of Rome, arranged in the pattern the creature had learned to use for one specific meaning: departure. He had been selected, not randomly, not by lot. The creature had observed the column for 6 days. It had watched the Optio map the old camps. It had watched him trace the carved warnings with his fingers. It had watched him study the archived equipment with recognition rather than fear. It had identified out of 500 soldiers the one who was paying attention, the one who was reading its messages, the one who might, finally, carry the message back to Rome in a way that would be understood. The creature had chosen its messenger. The guide appeared beside the Optio. He was calm, calmer than the Optio had ever seen him. "It wants you to go," he said. "It has always wanted one of you to go. That is the arrangement. That has always been the arrangement. One goes back. One tells Rome. Rome does not listen. But one always goes back because it believes it has to believe that eventually one of you will make them listen." The Optio asked if the guide would come with him. The guide shook his head. "I am not going back," he said. "I was dead when they put me in chains. I have been dead for years. This is a better place to stop than any Rome could give me." He paused. "It will not hurt me. I am not in formation. I am not Roman. I am just a man in a forest, and it has never harmed a man who is just in a forest. It harms Rome. It harms the thing that will not stop coming." The Optio looked at the 400 soldiers still locked in formation. He looked at the legate, who was standing inside the shield wall with his sealed orders in his hand, and the expression of a man whose every assumption about the world had been removed in a single morning. He asked the guide, "What happens to them?" The guide said, "They are in formation. They are a structure. It will wait. When they break, when they get hungry enough, or thirsty enough, or tired enough to stop being a unit and become men, it will take them. One by one. Gently. The way it has always taken them. And it will add their things to the record, and it will wait for the next 500. The Optio walked out of the clearing at noon on the 7th day. He did not say goodbye to the soldiers. He could not. They watched him go 417 men in a Roman shield wall, holding the only formation they knew, staring at the one man among them who had been given permission to leave, and he could not meet their eyes. He picked up his equipment from the place the creature had laid it, and he walked west. The forest opened for him. Not dramatically, not with any visible mechanism. The trees simply permitted passage. Where the column had struggled through dense undergrowth and trackless ground on the march in, the Optio found a clear path, not a road, not a trail, but an absence of obstruction that guided him westward as surely as any Roman highway. Branches did not catch his armor. Roots did not trip his feet. The ground was firm and even. The creature was not merely allowing him to leave, it was escorting him out. He walked for 3 days. He did not sleep. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clearing, and the formation, and the soldiers' faces, and the vast, patient, exhausted thing between the trees that had been trying to tell Rome to stop for 100 years. He tried, during those 3 days, to compose his report. He was a Roman soldier. He believed in the power of a clear, well-structured report to change the course of events. He had spent 17 years watching competent reports move through the chain of command and produce competent results. He believed that if he could describe what he had seen with sufficient precision, sufficient authority, sufficient evidence, someone in the command structure would read it and understand. He drafted the report in his head as he walked. He organized it by section terrain assessment, threat identification, behavioral analysis, strategic recommendation. He rehearsed the language, choosing words that would convey the creature's intelligence without sounding like superstition, its scale without sounding like fantasy, its communication attempts without sounding like madness. He built a report that was, by any professional standard, extraordinary detailed, measured, specific, credible. It would not matter. He emerged from the forest on the evening of the 9th day. The frontier outpost at Mogontiacum was visible across the Rhine, its torches burning in the dusk. He crossed at the ford, climbed the embankment, and identified himself to the gate watch. The duty officer came quickly, too quickly, the Optio noted, as if he had been waiting. The Optio delivered his report. He spoke for over an hour. He described the outposts, the old camps, the carved warnings, the boundary, the clearing, the archive, the creature, the formation diagram, the sealed orders, the deaths, the selection. He spoke with the clarity and composure of a man who has organized his testimony with 17 years of military discipline and 3 days of solitary rehearsal. The duty officer wrote it down, every word. Then the courier arrived. The Optio watched the rider come through the gate and knew before the man dismounted, knew before the sealed pouch was opened, knew before the orders were read what the documents would say. He had seen this scene before. He was living in a loop that Rome had been running for a century. The orders were dated 3 days prior. They instructed the garrison commander to classify the verbal report under the Schwarzwald administrative notation, to restrict access to command staff, to transfer the surviving soldier to the garrison at Syene, Egypt, effective immediately, and to file the standing requisition for the next Schwarzwald sector expedition, to be dispatched no sooner than 14 months from the current date. The Optio did not protest. He did not argue. He did not attempt to circumvent the orders or appeal to a higher authority. He had seen the creature's archive. He knew how many times this exact scene had played out: a survivor walking out, delivering a report, watching the report disappear into the system. He knew that the men who had carved warnings on wooden posts in the deep forest had done so because they understood that their verbal reports would never be read. The carvings were an act of desperation, messages left for the next group of dead men because the living institution would not listen. He asked the duty officer one question: "How many times has this happened?" The duty officer, who was not, the Optio sensed, a cruel man, but a tired one, a man performing a function he had inherited and did not fully understand, said, "You're the 23rd. That I've processed." The Optio noted the phrasing, "That I've processed." The duty officer had not been at this post for a century, but the duty officer before him had processed the previous survivor, and the one before that. The function was older than any individual. It was a role as formalized and unquestioned as any position in the Roman military hierarchy. The Optio was transferred to Syene within the week. He traveled by military transport river to the coast to Alexandria, river again to Upper Egypt. At each stage, his transport orders carried the administrative code that meant, "Do not engage this man in conversation about his previous posting." He was not a prisoner. He was not under guard. He was simply wrapped in a bureaucratic silence that followed him like a shadow, ensuring that his story remained contained within the system that had already decided not to hear it. He served at Siena for 31 years. He never returned to the Rhine. He never saw the Black Forest again. He never received the honorable discharge he had been promised before the expedition, the discharge that would have allowed him to return to his family in Ostia. His personnel file, as far as it existed, showed an unremarkable career ending in a routine provincial posting. There was no record of the Schwarzwald expedition. There was no record of his testimony. There was no record that he had ever stood in a clearing in the Black Forest and watched a creature older than civilization try to explain, in a language it had built from the bones of the dead, that it simply wanted to be left alone. But 31 years is a long time. And in the Temple of Thoth at Syene, there was a priest who listened to soldiers' stories, the way priests everywhere listen without judgment, without agenda, with the patience that comes from serving a God of knowledge whose entire doctrine is that things should be written down. The Optio told him everything. The priest wrote it down. In Demotic Egyptian, on papyrus, in a temple archive that Rome's administrative censors would never think to search. The account survived the fall of the empire, the rise of Christianity, the Arab conquest of Egypt, and the slow decay of the temple itself. It was found in 1901 by a German archaeological team excavating the temple ruins, a team from, of all places, the University of Freiburg. It was catalogued, translated, and published in an obscure academic journal. It was not widely read. I read it. And now I need to tell you what I found when I went looking for corroboration. The requisition records at Mogontiacum, the 49 identical forms spanning 120 years, are real. They are held in the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum in Mainz. They are catalogued as an administrative anomaly, a bureaucratic curiosity, a filing error that no one has satisfactorily explained. The academic consensus is that they represent a clerical duplication. The same form copied repeatedly by different scribes who mistakenly believed they were processing new orders. This explanation requires you to believe that Roman military scribes, the most meticulous record keepers in the ancient world, men who were flogged for transposition errors, made the same mistake 49 times across 5 generations. The transfer orders are real too. Fragmentary, scattered across archives in 6 countries, but traceable. Individual soldiers moved from Rhine Frontier postings to distant provinces at intervals that correspond, within a margin of months, to the requisition dates. Egypt, Judea, Britannia, Mauritania. As far from the Schwarzwald as the empire could reach. The Germanic oral tradition is real. Medieval monastery records in the Schwarzwald region contain references to a practice the monks called Die Römer Futterung, the Roman feeding. The monks attributed it to tribal legend. The tribal legend described it as history. The archaeological survey is real. In 2003, a ground-penetrating radar study of the central Schwarzwald, conducted as part of a forestry management assessment, not an archaeological project, identified a subsurface anomaly approximately 11 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. The anomaly was characterized by unusually dense root structures, atypical soil mineralization, and what the survey team described as a coherent subsurface biological network of indeterminate origin. The finding was noted in the survey report and not investigated further. The area is not formally restricted, but no hiking trails pass through it, no forestry operations are conducted within it, and the nearest village, a community of approximately 400 people, has a local tradition, dating back further than anyone can remember, of not entering that part of the forest. They don't have a reason. They've never needed one. The habit is older than reasons. I went to the Schwarzwald in 2019. I drove to the nearest access point to the survey anomaly. I parked at a forestry road and walked to the edge of the trees. The forest there is dense, dark, and silent in a way that I am not equipped to describe objectively, because I had spent 2 years reading about what Roman soldiers experienced in that silence, and I cannot separate my observation from their testimony. I will tell you what I saw. The trees at the edge of that section grow differently. The trunks are darker. The canopy is lower and thicker. The undergrowth is nearly absent. The forest floor is clean, bare, carpeted in needles that look as if they have been arranged. The air is cooler by several degrees. There are no birds. I did not enter. I told myself it was because of the terrain, no trail, no clear path, no way to navigate without GPS equipment I hadn't brought. But that is not the truth. The truth is that I stood at the edge of those trees and felt something I have never felt before and have no adequate language for. Not fear, not awe. Something older than both a recognition, deep in the body, beneath the level of conscious thought, that I was standing at a boundary, that the space beyond it was occupied, and that the occupant was aware of me and patient and profoundly, unspeakably tired of being visited by people who would not listen. I drove back to Freiburg. I filed my notes. I did not return. The administrative records at Mogontiacum contain one final detail that I have not yet mentioned because I wanted you to have the full story before you encountered it. The 49 requisition forms span from approximately 12 BC to 109 AD. They are regular one every 14 to 20 months, without significant interruption, for over a century. And then they stop. The 49th form is the last. There is no 50th. The cessation is not explained anywhere in the archive. There is no order canceling the program. There is no report declaring the threat resolved. There is no notation of any kind indicating why a monitoring system that had operated continuously for 120 years simply stopped. But the 49th form has something the others do not. In the margin, in a hand that does not match the scribe who prepared the form, someone has written a single annotation. The ink is different. The script is smaller. It was added after the form was filed, perhaps days after, perhaps years. There is no way to date it precisely. The annotation reads, Finis terminatur, nulla alia missio necessaria est. The boundary is established. No further mission is required. Someone listened. After a century, after 49 expeditions, after more than 20,000 Roman soldiers walked into the Black Forest and did not walk out. After a creature older than civilization spent 100 years learning to speak in a language of swords and bones and formation diagrams, saying the same thing over and over and over again. Stop coming. This is mine. I do not want to hurt you. Please stop coming. Someone, finally, read the message. I do not know who wrote that annotation. I do not know what rank they held, or what evidence convinced them, or what it cost them to countermand a program that had been running since before the birth of Christ. I do not know if they believed the creature was real, or if they simply looked at a century of dead soldiers and decided, on purely practical grounds, that the experiment had generated enough data. I know only that they stopped it, and the Black Forest, that specific section, that 11-kilometer stretch of silence and dark trees and absence, has been unbroken ever since. 2,000 years. No roads, no settlements, no trails, no record of anyone entering and reporting what they found. The boundary holds. Whatever was agreed in that final annotation, in that last act of a bureaucrat who may have been the only Roman in a century to actually read the creature's message, the agreement is still in force. The creature asked for one thing, the only thing it ever asked for, the thing it said with swords driven into trees and bones, sorted by material and formation diagrams built from the equipment of the dead. Leave me alone. And someone, eventually, did. The question that keeps me awake, the question I cannot answer, the question that sits in the margin of my own notes, the way that annotation sits in the margin of the last requisition, is not what is the creature. I don't think that question has an answer in any language humans currently possess. The question is, why did it take so long? The creature communicated clearly. It communicated repeatedly. It communicated in Rome's own language, using Rome's own symbols, following Rome's own organizational logic. It did everything a rational entity could do to deliver a simple, reasonable message to a civilization that prided itself on reason. And that civilization, the most organized, most literate, most administratively sophisticated empire the world had ever seen, took 120 years and 20,000 dead soldiers to hear a single sentence. I think about that sometimes when I read about the things we are doing now, the systems we are running, the warnings we are receiving, the boundaries we are crossing again and again and again, because the machinery of crossing has its own momentum, and the people inside it cannot find the form to make it stop. I think about a creature in a forest, patient beyond any human measure, arranging the swords of the dead to point toward home. And I wonder who, this time, will write the annotation. The requisition records referenced in this account are held in the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum, Mainz, Germany, under catalog designation RGZ-MIL-A DM-0774-0822. The Cyan Temple Papyrus is held in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, under designation JE-47203. The 2003 subsurface survey is available through the Baden-Württemberg State Forestry Archive. The annotation on the final requisition form has not been independently dated. The section of the Black Forest described in this account remains untrailed and unsettled. Local forestry authorities classify it as a natural conservation zone, though no formal protected status has been applied. When asked why the area has never been developed, The forestry office in Freiburg stated that there has simply never been a request. No one has asked to go there. The request has never been filed.